Tabla is generally spoken of as percussive accompaniment, but its role in Khayal and instrumental music is more than that. The theka played on the tabla is actually the timekeeper for the ensemble, for all the musicians on stage, and indeed for the audience who follow the music. That is, the musicians performing as well as the audience have only the theka of the tala performed on the tabla as a reference for time or tala. Let us look at Tala very briefly in the historical context. That is, Tala is extensively discussed in the textual tradition, and one description of Tala is that it is the Tala is what provides a common ground for all the performers. So, for instance, when there are various instruments and different various musicians are playing them, how do they come on the same ground? How do they synchronize? It is Tala which does that in this music. Other kinds of music have other devices, but for our music it is Tala that uh, brings all of them on the uh, same page, as it were. All musicians who are performing, and in fact the audience, they all are on the same page. They know, they share that time. Um, and this Tala needs to be made available to all musicians and the audience for that matter. That is, if Tala is a time cycle, how do all the musicians and the audience have follow the same time cycle? How does it happen? So there is either a visual or an auditory aid to that helps them follow the Tala cycle. That is, to know the structuring that the music should follow. Now, originally, the cymbals, right, cymbals, the tal, were the keepers of the tala in the music of uh, the earlier treatises. In fact, they are referred to as tala. And even today, the cymbals that are used in Bharatanatyam and Nagaswaram performances in Carnatic music are called talam. The the instrument is called talam because its primary function and only function is to keep time or mark the tala. And so in this case, it is an auditory aid. In Carnatic music, some of you might have seen a Carnatic performance. Musicians perform the tala with their hands. That is the lead musician. If she is a vocalist, then they perform the tala with their hands constantly. And this is obviously a visual aid. There is everybody, all the musicians and the audience have only the performance of the tala on the hand as the aid. That which tells you where the tala is, which part of the tala you are in, and so on. Now the tabla offers an auditory aid too, so that all performers, including the audience, are able to keep track of the time cycle, which is indispensable to music making and appreciating. Now, what is the implication of this? So, as I said, in Carnatic music, the singer maintains the tala with her hands throughout the performance. And the mridangam, which is the percussive accompaniment in Carnatic music, the mridangam player is constantly improvising to actually accompany the music. In fact, even in Dhrupad, the tala is performed by the hand, by the singer, and the pakhavich player is for most part not playing just the theka, but is improvising, because the tala is being maintained by the hand gestures. Now in Khayal, the tala is rarely, if ever, performed through hand gestures during a performance, and we have only the theka of the tabla as reference for tala. Now there are two implications of this. First, it frees up the vocalist, the singer, in a unique way, and we will talk more about this in the later lessons. That is one of the very unique features of Khayal. And when we say that Khayal is a freer idiom, this is one of the reasons. This is a very important reason why Khayal offers more freedom for improvisation. But this, the other implication of the tabla being the timekeeper, as it were. The other implication is that the tabla player only plays the theka for most part, with of course mild variations depending on the music, but the tabla player never strays very far from the basic theka of the tal, except of course in specified places. The tabla player does indulge in some improvisation when he gets a cue from the lead performer. And then what happens, the task of keeping time or the tala is entrusted to the melodic accompanist for those few avartanas. And the time or tala is maintained through the repeated rendition of a line of the bandish or composition, which also will give the tala framework. Now, how is it possible for the theka to stand in as timekeeper, as being the reference point for the tala for everyone? That is, how can one keep track of tala by listening to the tabla's strokes, the theka? How is it possible? Right? It can't be trivial. I mean, how? It's not easy to just listen to the strokes of the tabla and know which part of the tala you are in. But an important factor here is the contrast between the khali and the bhari. That is, this refers to the soundscape of the theka. Khali literally means empty, and bhari means filled. So in the bhari portions of the theka, the left drum or the daya or dagga is played with full resonance using the fingers and the base of the hand, of the palm, while in the khali parts, the left hand is just flat on the surface of the dagga and it is damped. And one cannot but think of the sashabda and nishabda kriyas that I referred to in the last video. Let us look at a demonstration of the khali and bhari in the context of teen tal.
Bhari. Khali.
So then, teen tal, which is divided into 4 equal parts of 4 matras each, has a structure of tali, tali, khali, tali. And this contrast between khali and bhari, right? The tali is the bhari portions of the theka, and the khali is of course a khali. So this contrast between the khali and bhari makes possible following the tal by listening to the theka. Then in this case, the khali portion, that is the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, in fact one should actually say 10, 11, 12 and 13th matras they are khali. That is, you don't have the dagga resonating there. So it's dha, tin, tin, ta, ta, dhin. So then the bhari portion follows this Khali portion, and that gives a cue about which part of the Tala cycle we are in. Of course, Tala is, often retained in the head. The musicians, especially seasoned performers, simply carry the Tala in their heads. But that's not easy for everyone. It's not easy for everyone to keep track of the Tala just in the head when you're improvising in a slow 16 matra teen tal, or even slower 12 matra ek tal. It's not trivial. The soundscape of contrast between Bhari and Khali is found in all talas. You might revisit the talas that were demonstrated in the last video and you can see. So again, Jhap tal, for instance, dhi na, dhi na, ti na, dhi na. So dhi na, dhi na, both of them are Bhari. Ti na, that is Khali. Dhi na, which is again Bhari. So you have Bhari, Khali, Bhari. And this, when the Khali portion leads, suddenly erupts into the Bhari sound, you're at a particular place in the Tala cycle. So that is how actually it works. And needless to say, being able to discern the Tala soundscape and make out what stroke is being played, and being able to keep track of the Tala cycle with the sound of the tabla strokes and theka while also singing, that is something that comes with considerable practice, but it will come with practice. Now, because Khayal frees up the performer from having to maintain the tala in his hand, transferring the role of timekeeper or tala reference to the tabla and the tabla player, the art of Khayal is unique. This is especially stark in the case of the Vilambit exploration. As we will see soon, Khayal has a unique relation with Tala. In the next video, we will see how Khayal compositions are structured around Tala.